Welcome everyone to another week of Ramban ala Parsha, Ramban ala Torah. This week we have the schus to read Parshas Behar. I think we'll see at some point that the Ramban really sees Behar and Bechukotai as being one parsha. It's necessary for certain parshanim or parshanut, but in fact, because it's a leap year, we read them separately. Okay. The parsha, everybody notes this. Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Har Sinai lemor. Right? Sometimes the parsha is interesting. The introduction is interesting because of who it's addressed to. Vayikra Moshe Vayidaber Elav Me'ol Moed lemor. That's the beginning of Vayikra. It happened in Ol Moed. Last week's parsha, Amor la Kohanim b'nei Aaron, right, to the Kohanim and not to b'nei Yisrael. There are certain introductions that kind of, require a drasha or require some understanding. And Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Har Sinai is one of them, especially because not just Rashi's famous question, which is really the Medrash, Ma inyan Shemitta etzel Har Sinai, which, by the way, I think is the original source for when I was a kid. People used to say, what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? That's Ma inyan etzel Har Sinai. What does that have to do with Har Sinai? But it's a much more serious question for the Ramban and for a person who thinks that the Torah is written in order. If you recall, when we did the introduction, the Ramban's Hakdama to Sefer Vayikra, he really didn't deal with Behar and Bechukotai. He talked about, Torah Kohanim and how the Parshiot deal with issues that are particular to Kohanim and to how you run the Mishkan. And it made a lot of sense, right? Shmos was building the Mishkan. The end of Shmos was building the Mishkan and the Makam Ashras Hashchina. And then came how you run the Mishkan. But nothing really about Behar and Bechukotai. So the Ramban owes us that explanation, and that's what we're going to do first here. We're not going to really deal with the Ma inyan Shemitta etzel Har Sinai. That, I think the Ramban has a disagreement with Rashi about, and it's interesting, and we'll see this a few times in this week's parsha. You can't disagree with a sifra. When Rashi quotes a Medrash halacha, when Rashi quotes a Medrash, okay, maybe the Ramban on Midrashei Agada sometimes feels the ability to disagree with the Medrash Agada. But in Medrash Halacha, the Ramban has to accept it. When he has a problem with Rashi, it's in Rashi's understanding of the Medrash Halacha. But first, let's start. It's hard to tell exactly when. It's a bit into the first Ramban on the Torah, and the Ramban is going to try to deal with the flow of the Parshios. It's something that most people don't focus on, because the primary focus is on Har Sinai and the Sifra's famous parish that Klalos and Protos, we learned from here that all Klalos and Protos were given at Har Sinai. But let's move to the second point, which I think is a bigger point. V'inyan har parsha hazot shenichtav bekan. Okay, what's it doing here? What's Parshas Behar and Parshas Bechukotai doing at the end of Sefer Vayikra? So first we're going to quote the Ibn Ezra. Amar Rabbi Avraham. Ki zot habrit hakituva beparshat ve'ela hamishpatim. Says the Ibn Ezra, and the Ramban's going to like it with a certain change. Says the Ibn Ezra, no, this is a continuation of Maimad Har Sinai. It's not just that this was told at Har Sinai. It's actually a continuation from Mishpatim. Mishpatim obviously being the end of Maimad Har Sinai, the end of the Kabbalat Brit Har Sinai with the blood and all things like that. Okay, so the Ibn Ezra is going to tell us, and the Ramban's quoting here, V'inyan parsha zot shenichtav bekan, Amar Rabbi Avraham, ki zot habrit hakituva b'parshat ve'ela mishpatim. Right, Ela mishpatim being again the end of Maimad Har Sinai, being the Brit, the Aganot and the spilling of blood. Right, the first covenant that HaKadosh Baruch Hu entered into with Klal Yisrael, with Bnei Yisrael, was at Har Sinai, and it's recounted in Mishpatim. Ukishekiblu al nafsham na'aseh v'nishma, the famous Brit na'aseh v'nishma, az nichrat habrit. So God entered into a covenant with us. V'amar lohem kol haparsha azot, and told us all of Behar and Bechukotai. That's really fascinating. V'hizkira b'makom hazeh lechaber t'nai haaretz, and happens to be that the Torah told us that which HaKadosh Baruch Hu said in Parshas Mishpatim only at the end of Vayikra. Okay, because we're about to enter Eretz Yisrael. Ki kasher amar al ha'arayot, ki ba'avuram takiotam ha'aretz. Just like the end of Parshas Emor has arayot, and the arayot No, the end of Parshas Kedoshim has arayot, and the arayot are, if you're not going to keep the arayos, you're going to get kicked out of Eretz Yisrael. Kain Amar beParshas im bechukotai al Shabbatot haaretz v'utzraf tchila lahazkira Shabbatot. Okay, so he says, so too, the inyan of Shemitta is written here because Shemitta, God forbid, is going to cost us, or has cost us, according to Chazal, our ownership of Eretz Yisrael. So it's fundamental. Now, the Ramban, of course, can't agree to that because the Ramban thinks Yesh Mukdam U'uchar B'Torah. So the Ramban has a fantastic insight. Listen to this. Ulefi da'ati ki nichtava kan b'seder nachon. Says the Ramban, not surprisingly. No, it's written in the proper order. Now, how does it work? So here you need a great man like the Ramban to sort of go up to 30,000 feet and be able to look at all of Sefer Shmos and all of Sefer Vayikra to see a theme and to see a flow. So says the Ramban, Ki perush Bahar Sinai. What does it mean? Vayidava Hashem Moshe Bahar Sinai lemor ba'aloto sham lekabel luchot shniyot. When Moshe went up to Har Sinai to accept the second luchos, ubier ha'inyan ki bitchilat arba'im yom harishonim shaluchot harishonot katav Moshe b'sefer abrit et kol divrei Hashem. What happens? You have Parshas Yisro, right? You have Aser Sadibus, so you have the actual Maimon Har Sinai. Then you have Mishpatim, Moshe Rabbeinu writing down the halachos that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him, reading that almost contemporaneously. Then you have the Brit, Ma'amad Har Sinai, the Brit Aganot. Let's see if I could find it quickly. You're talking in Mishpatim. You have the regalim. Hinenochi shalech malach. Ve'el Moshe amar alei al Hashem va'atav aron adav va'avihu. Right? Vayavo Moshe vayisaper la'am et kol direi Hashem ve'et kol ha'mishpatim vayan kolam kol achad vayomru kol ha'dvrim asher diber Hashem na'aseh vayichtov Moshe divrei. Right? Then there's the bris. Vayishlach et na'arei b'nei Yisrael vayalu olot vayizbechu zivachim shlamim l'Hashem parim vayikach Moshe chatzi adam. That's the end of Maimon Har Sinai, right? The Brit Na'aseh v'nishma, the Brit Ha'aganot. Ukishachatu ba'egel. Then, according to Ramban, what happens? You have Truma and Tetzaveh is what God had told Moshe at Har Sinai about the need to build a Mishkan. Again, why? Because the Mishkan is a Makom Hashras HaShechina. And Maimon Har Sinai required the Mishkan. Okay? Then, Ukishechatu ba'egel in Parshas Kitisa, when we sinned with the Egel, V'nishtabru aluchot, Ki'ilu nitbatla habrita hi etzel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We breached the covenant. We were no longer the chosen people. Vis-a-vis HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the covenant had been abrogated. Kadosh Baruch Hu Moshe beluchot shniyot. When God forgave us and He gave us a second luchos in Kitisa, tzivo bebrit chadasha shenemar hinei anochi karit brit. A new covenant. God enters into a new covenant with us. Vehechazir sham hamitzvot hachamurot shenamru b'sei devei mishpatim b'brit harishona. And God repeats some of the significant mitzvos that had already been written in Mishpatim. V'amar kitov lecha et hadvarim ha'ela ki al pi hadvarim ha'ela karati et itcha brit vet Yisrael. V'ratza HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'achmir aleihem bebrit hazot hashniya shetihiyah aleihem ba'alot u'biklalot. Now, the first bris took place, hard to know why, with blood. Now HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to do a new covenant, and the new covenant is going to be achieved with Bnei Yisrael through the brachot and klalot that are written in Parshas Bechukotai, through more or less what we refer to as the Tochacha. V'shetiyeh karishona al kol hamitzvot harishonot v'al kol hamishpatim k'mo shenemar brit harishona et kol divrei Hashem v'et kol hamishpatim ulefikach amar bekan b'sof hatochachot ela hachukim v'hamishpatim v'hatorot asher natan Hashem beineu vein kol bnei Yisrael b'Har Sinai b'yad Moshe. Why the need for that statement at the end of the Tochacha? Says the Ramban, because That's the Brit. That's the covenant that we're entering into with HaKadosh Baruch Hu that seals the second Luchot. So you have sort of a continuation from the end of Kitisa all the way through the end of Vayikra. Now, why? Who wrote? Okay, so says the Ramban. V'hinei, b'sefer habrit harishon ne'emra hashvi'it bichlal kimo she'izkarti. Shemitta gets mentioned in the first covenant in Mishpatim, shenemar v'hashvi'it tishmitenu netashta. Va'ata b'brit hazot hashenit ne'emra b'protel v'dikdukel v'onsheha. But now Shemitta gets written in detail. Ube'et habrit harishona hahi shehu ba'arba'im yom harishonim nitztava Moshe al mishkan. So what happens? Originally, Moshe Rabbeinu tells him about the Mishkan. Ukishen nitratza lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'tzivaho lichrot lahem brit shniya. When God tells Moshe, okay, the people are forgiven, and he goes to make a second covenant with them, Yarad Moshe v'yitzavim et kol asher tziva Hashem oto Har Sinai. Moshe Rabbeinu tells them all that he'd been commanded on Har Sinai. V'hayam ma'aseh mishkan miklalam. This is really a fascinating idea. So the first thing he tells them is about the mitzvah to build a Mishkan. V'az hikil Moshe kol adat b'nei Yisrael v'amar lohem ki b'tchila ele hadvarim asher tziva Hashem lasot otam b'mlechet hamishkan v'hinei kiblu hadavar b'simcha v'yatsu milifanav miyad. The way the Ramban implies is Moshe was in the middle of his speech. The beginning of the speech was the Mishkan, it's true. But he wanted to get to all of the stuff in Vayikra. But the people basically ran out. Uba'u kulav v'natnu hanidava va'asu hamishkan v'ishlimu malachto. The people basically ran out and started giving donations. V'ka'ashehu kam miyad. So that's an interruption, right? There's an enormous excitement. And all of Klal Yisrael is associated in somehow with the building of the Mishkan. Finally, when the Mishkan is built, v'ka'ashehu kam miyad vayikra Moshe vaydaber Hashem elav me'ol moed. That's the beginning of Vayikra. That's the continuation of the speech that Moshe started to give at the end of Shmos. V'tzivo b'karbonot b'chol Torat HaKohanim. Okay, it's taking too long. I'll say it out loud. Basically, then Moshe told them all about the halachos of the Mishkan, Vayikra, Tzav, Shmini, Tazrir, and the things that came associated with it. And at the end of it comes parashas Behar and B'chukosai. Comes the Shemitta, and comes the covenant that God is entering into with Klal Yisrael. The Brit HaTochacha, not the blood. Now, the Ramban doesn't explain, and I can't possibly explain, why God the first time thought that it made sense to enter into a covenant in which blood is spilled on Bnei Yisrael, and the second time thought that the covenant should be with the brachot and klalot. It seems the first time it didn't work. It led to the sin of the Egel. But either way, says the Ramban, Behar and B'chukotai is basically the end of Maimad Har Sinai. It was all, it was interrupted by the building of the Mishkan because of the excitement that the people had. But really, lechatchila, Moshe would have told them the whole thing up front before the building of the Mishkan. I really think this is a fantastic insight of the Ramban. And also, it saves the Ramban's general pshat of Yesh Mukdam Mu'char B'Torah. It's not like the Ibn Ezra says. In theory, the Ibn Ezra agrees with the Ramban that this has to do with Maimon Har Sinai. But the Ibn Ezra thinks that it was given beforehand and it was only said here out of place. So the Ramban, no, if it was said here, that's when it happened. And the reason is because Bnei Yisrael interrupted the speech and basically built the Mishkan. They were so excited. They all got involved, so the Moshe Rabbeinu had to wait. After the Mishkan was built, Moshe Rabbeinu continued with the first pasuk of Vayikra and all the rules of the Mishkan. And finally, you get to Shemitta and to the end of parashas of Sefer Vayikra. You get to the Tochacha and the Brachot and the Klalot, which is in fact the covenant that God entered into with Bnei Yisrael. I'll just admit to you, this explains everything through the middle or through towards the end of B'chukotai, but it doesn't stop. The parsha, the Torah ends, Eila hachukim v'mishpatim v'hatorot asher natan Hashem beino uvein kol bnei Yisrael uvein bnei Yisrael b'Har Sinai b'yad Moshe. But that's not the end of Sefer Vayikra. And hopefully next week we'll figure out and have to talk about how Erechin and the last parsha of Sefer Vayikra, what it's doing there. Okay, that's the major point that I wanted to make about the beginning of the parsha. Then, we have an interesting pasuk. And Rashi is interested, what does it mean, Shabbat Lashem? So Rashi quotes the Medrash, L'Shem Hashem. It should be, when you rest on Shabbos, it should be for God's benefit. Kishem shenemar b'Shabbat Breshit. Okay, that's Rashi. Just like Shabbos Breshit is Shabbat Lashem, so too Shemitta, which is a form of Shabbos, is also Shabbat Lashem. V'Rabotenu, says the Ramban, wait, Chazal lo kach nitkavnu b'medrasham. It's true that it's a medrash, but he doesn't think that's the right pshat. Ki kol Hashem, this is a strong question. Ki kol hashabbatot gam hamoadim l'shem Hashem. It's true that Shabbos is l'shem Hashem, but so's Yom Kippur, and so's Pesach, and so's Sukkot. We're not doing it for us, we're doing it for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'lo ye'omer be'achad mehem l'Hashem. It doesn't say it's being done l'Hashem. Aval omar yihiyeh lochem Shabbaton, v'amar b'yom HaKippurim Shabbat Shabbaton hu lochem. How come it doesn't say in Yom Kippur Shabbat Shabbaton hu l'Hashem? V'loshen abrayso b'toras konim Shabbat l'Hashem, kishem shenemar b'Shabbat Breshit, kach nemar b'Shvi'it Shabbat l'Hashem. So what is the pshat? So says the Ramban, Aval perush Shabbat l'Hashem elokecha ha'amur b'Shabbat Breshit, kivo shavat va'inafash. This is the Ramban. It's not just the Torah says there's a Shabbat l'Hashem. The Torah is saying God rested on that day. Okay, we don't know what it means for God to rest. But it's not just that the Torah is telling you should keep Shabbos l'Hashem. The Torah is telling you God kept Shabbos. Va'al kein lo ta'aseh kol melacha. Therefore you can't do melacha. Lekach amru zal ki kein ne'amar b'shmita ki hi shvi'it b'shanim. So the same way we keep Shabbat l'Hashem, because God kept Shabbos, so too we keep Shemitta, because Shemitta is exactly the same cycle of 7. 6 days work, 7th day rest. Shemitta, 6 years work, 7 days rest. But what's the L'Hashem? Does the Ramban think that God kept Shemitta? No, he doesn't. How does it work? So he says, V'hinei bekan, and we don't normally do Kabbalistic Rambans, but it's accessible, and it appears in a number of places in the Ramban. I think it's fine. V'hinei bekan oru otanu bisod gadol misodot haTorah. Right? This, says the Ramban, is a hint to a secret of the Torah, to a Kabbalistic idea in the Torah. Kvar ramaz lanu Rabbi Avraham shekatav. The Ibn Ezra already spilled the beans, so the Ramban can also spill the beans. V'tam Shabbat l'Hashem ki yom ha-Shabbat. Now what does that mean? V'sod yimot olam ramuz b'makom hazeh. Says the Ramban, there are 2 cycles of history or of nature. There's 6 days, as in 7th day is Shabbos. There's 6 years, and the 7th day is Shemitta. But there's also something else. There's 6 millennia, and the 7th millennia, the 7,000th year of the world, is a type of Olam Haba. How does that work? So he says, how does that work? V'chof aznecha lishma ma shani rashai lashmiacha mimenu b'lashon asher ashmiacha. I'm not going to tell you everything, says the Ramban, but I'll tell you the basic stuff. V'im tizkeh tidbonen. And if you're zocha, you'll understand. I hope we'll be zocha. Kvar katavti b'seder breshit ki sheshet yemei breshit heim yemot olam. It's not just the mini cycle of 6 days and the 7th day is Shabbos. It's hinting to the way the world works. V'yom ha-shvi'i Shabbat l'Hashem Elokecha. Ki vo yiyeh Shabbat l'Hashem hagadol k'mo sheshaninu. Ba-shvi'i. Ma hayomrim mizmor shil yom ha-Shabbat la'atid l'yom shekulu Shabbos nuchal l'chayil amim. It's not just the 7th day. It's the 7th millennia. Shekulo Shabbat u'mnuchal l'chayil amim. V'hinei hayomim remez la'asher bara b'ma'aseh breshit. V'hashanim yirmezu la'asher yihiyeh b'briyat kol yimei ha'olam. The Ramban is basically saying there's 6 days and the 7th, But each of the days, and this is a Maimer in Chazal also, is 1,000 years for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So in Breishis and other places, the Ramban is much more explicit. But he says basically the 6 days correspond to 6,000 years. And if you've ever heard this idea in Kabbalah that Mashiach has to come somehow, the Ramban doesn't necessarily tie it to Mashiach. But the 7th millennia is going to be something completely different. Right? It's going to be Yom Shkul Shabbos Nuchal Chai Olamim. It's going to be akin to Shabbos, given that we're in the year 5784. Tafshin Pei Dal is 5784. Okay, we're getting close. There are a lot of people, not to get too Zionistic, who talk about the 1,000 years as not being specifically 1,000 years, and that the founding of the state of Israel at the end of the 6th millennium is the beginning of a new world. Without taking a stand, that's fascinating. If the Ramban meant it, that'd be unbelievable. But that's what we have to think about. So says the Ramban, there's a different cycle of history. So therefore, Al Kain, now a bigger point, Hichmir HaKatuv B'Shmita Yoter Mikol Chayvei Lavin V'Chayvei HaGalut La'aleha. Therefore, Shmita, which represents the 7th millennia, which represents a type of a different world in which God's presence is accessible and well known to everybody, of course the Torah is going to be more machmir with respect to Shmita. Kimo shechmir ba'arayot. Here you see the same thing we saw in the previous Ramban. This connection between arayot, which if God forbid we don't keep, if we don't keep sexual morality, we get kicked out of the land of Israel. If we don't keep Shmita, we get kicked out of the land of Israel. Shenemar oz tirtzaretz et shabtotea v'hichzir ha'inyan pamim rabot kol yemei hashamat tishbot. The Torah is going to pound this idea of an emar. V'arz te'azev mehem v'tiretz et shabtotea v'chein shaninu. Galut ba'a al inui hadin. If the law is not enforced properly, va'al ivut hadin. If we twist the law, God forbid, va'al shmita ta'aretz. Mipnei shekol hakofer ba eino modeh b'maaseh breshit u'ba'olam haba. Why? Because Shmita is a type of Shabbos. Shmita is a sign of the fact that God created the world, and God created a world with 6 millennia, and the 7th millennia is Shmita, is the 1,000 years of Shmita. It's different than the previous 6. Yirmiyahu expanded that and says you're going to go into exile if you don't let your slaves go. Shema anochi karati britet avotechem miketz sheva shanim ki gam be'eved shvi'it ki yovel. With respect to an eved who's supposed to work to you for 6 years and get out on Shemitah, it's the same thing as Shabbos. It's the same thing as Yovel. Yovel is basically a reset of the world, right? You can't have extremely rich people if you keep Yovel. How do most people get rich in the world? They acquire a lot of real estate. But if everything's going to go back at Yovel, the world's going to be reset. And the world's going to return to the way it had been when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created it. It's a bigger thought, it's a deeper thought, but it's the idea of the Ramban. So in the end, the Ramban has said Shemitah represents Shabbos here, not because Shabbat Lashem, because you're going to do it for Hashem. It's because in some metaphysical way, God celebrated or God kept the first Shabbos, the 7th day, and God kept or will keep or is keeping the 7th millennia as some kind of, super Shabbos, as a Yom Shekulo, Shabbat U'Menucha L'Chayei Olamim, as a different type of world. Okay, let's see what we have time for. Let's do... Okay, there's a reference to Yom Kippur. If you look in Pasuk Tet, says the Torah, V'safarta lecha sheva shabtot shanim sheva pamim, right? You're going to keep 7 cycles of 7. V'ayu lecha yimei sheva shabtot shanim teisha v'arbanim shana. What's going to happen then? Yovel v'ha'avarta shofar Torah b'chodesh hashvi'i b'asar lachodesh. It's a strange phrase, right? V'ha'avarta shofar Torah b'chodesh hashvi'i b'asar lachodesh. You're going to blow shofar on the 10th day of the 7th month. B'yom ha'kippurim taviu shofar b'chol artzachem. Yeah, we know the 10th day of the 7th month is Yom Kippur. Why does the Torah have to give us the date
and the name of it. Says the Ramban. First quoting Rashi. Mi mashma shenamar b'yom kippurim eini yodea shu b'asar lachodesh im kein lama nemar b'asar lachodesh ela tikiyat be'asar lachodesh doche Shabbat b'chol artzechem ve'ein turat Rosh Hashanah doche Shabbat b'chol artzechem ela b'beit din bilvad. Rashi quotes a limud that with respect to Rosh Hashanah is not going to be doche Shabbos. You're not going to blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah unless it's in the Beis HaMikdash or unless it's in a Bezdin. But with respect to Yovel, on Yom Kippur, Yovel is going to be doche Shabbos of Yom Kippur, and people will blow shofar. Says the Ramban now. And it's a great, great line. Listen to this. V'nei harav mipnei b'kiyuto b'talmud. He says Rashi was such a bucky in Gemaros, in Brisos, in Mishnayos. V'akol lefanav kishulchan aruch. It's all laid out in front of him like a shulchan aruch. Eino choshesh v'sotei ma'braitot. So he wasn't so careful. So he just made the bigger point. Ve'hein mitaot. But it's gonna lead to a mistake. The Shabbat Adam who aren't as smart as Rashi. So again, just the line. V'akol lefanav kishulchan aruch. Right? The Ramban never saw a shulchan aruch. Rashi never saw a shulchan aruch. You know, I'd love to claim I have no support. You know, this is why the Shulchan Aruch called it the Shulchan Aruch, because the Ramban says it. There are other places also, a set table. But it's so beautiful how the Ramban says it. It's like Rashi has it all in front of him. He's not worried that we're going to misunderstand, but he said, we are not as smart as Rashi will understand. So what's the real pshat? Sheyaduahu barur bigmara ki hatikiyot kulan shel Rosh Hashanah v'yom HaKippurim va'afilu shel rishut mutarot hein b'Shabbat lefishi chachma ve'ina malacha. This is the Ramban, but Rashi knew this. He just doesn't say because he wasn't careful. In Gemara, in Mishnayos, in Brisos, in the Psukim, you blow shofar on Shabbos. The Gemara makes it clear. Blowing shofar is not a malacha. It's a chachma. So why don't we blow shofar? V'tokinu b'yom B'din Torah b'Shabbat shel Rosh Hashanah shel Yom Kippurim. Right? Min HaTorah, you're supposed to blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah. V'inyan hatkiyah b'Beis Din. So how did it happen? Again, we've lost this minhag also. Although I hear there are people in Yerushalayim who go to a Beis Din and blow shofar like the original takana was. V'inyan hatkiyah b'Beit Din tiknu Rab Yochanan ben Zakkai mishacharev Beit HaMikdash. Lefi shegazru ba mipnei shakol chayavim b'tkiyat shofar shema yitlenu biyado v'yelech etzel bakilul mod v'yavirna arba mod b'shuta rabim. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai made gzera. First Chazal made gzera. Right? Since we all have to blow shofar, but not everybody knows how to blow shofar. What happens? We might, God forbid, carry it on Rosh Hashanah to somebody's house to teach us how to blow. V'hitir lanu Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai b'Beis Din bilvad. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, fine, but in a Beis Din, where the Emas HaBezdin is on each person, nobody's going to carry on Shabbos, so we'll blow there. Says the Ramban, let's be honest. But the pasuk doesn't mean this. That's not what's going on. Umashi izkiru tkiyah be'asar doche Shabbat, lomar shehi na'aseit b'chol Yom HaKippurim, ki hadechiyah b'Yom HaKippurim shechol yot b'Shabbat, v'shechol yot b'chol achati. Sheyom HaKippurim b'Shabbat l'chol malacha bein lahotzah bein l'chol hamelachot. Says the Ramban, when the Torah talks about Yom Kippur, it's talking about Shabbos. They're the same thing. Yom Kippur shechol yos b'Shabbos and Yom Kippur shechol yot b'Yom Revi'i. They're exactly the same. And the halacha is, says the Ramban, and this is a pshat in the pasuk, the halacha is that Yom Kippur is always going to be doche Shabbos. If you're at home in a Shnas HaYovel, you blow shofar on Yom Kippur. You don't have to go to the Beis HaMikdash. You don't have to go to Beis Din. You don't have to go to Shul. Because the Tekiyah of the 50th year is Docha Shabbos. Okay, so it's just a fascinating Ramban in which he points out that all the stuff that Rashi is telling you is not in the Psukim. It's not in the Torah. It's based on a Gzera of Chazal. And says the Ramban, it's true. We don't blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah. And by the way, it's like a fascinating topic. Why Chazal made that gzera and why it is that we don't blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah when Min HaTorah was supposed to. But says the Ramban, that's the fact. When the pasuk in Behar says, Taviu shofar b'chol artzechem, and that is b'chodesh hashvi be'asor lachodesh b'yom haKippurim, it's telling you that Yom Kippur is always going to be Doche Shabbos, and that even b'yechidus you can blow shofar during Yovel. Okay, went a little bit over time. We saw 3 Rambans today. The first one was the flow of the parshios from Maimon Har Sinai through the end of Sefer Vayikra, more or less. A fascinating Ramban about how it's really one long speech that was interrupted by the excitement of Bnei Yisrael to build the Mishkan. Then we saw Shabbat Lashem, this idea of the world being 7 millennia, 6 Chol, and the 7th being the type of Shabbos that God experiences, and there's more to say on that. It's really a fascinating idea. And finally, this last idea about Yom Kippur, about Taviu Shofar B'chol Artzechem, how Rashi's drasha from the Medrash assumes a lot of knowledge that we don't have, because it's not really in the Psukim, and the bottom line is Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are different. Rosh Hashanah, blowing shofar is not a malacha. On Rosh Hashanah, we blow shofar. It's a chachma, not a malacha. Therefore, it was originally mutter. And when Chazal made the gzeir, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, fine, but you can blow shofar in a bezdin, all of which is unnecessary with respect to Yom Kippur. Because Yom Kippur, in its nature, is Shabbos. It's not that every once in a while Yom Kippur falls out on Shabbos. Every year it's Shabbat, Shabbaton, and we blow shofar on Yom Kippur for Yovel in a way that's different than, both substantively and functionally, that's in a way that's different than the shofar that we blow on Rosh Hashanah. Shabbat Shalom, and see you next week, hopefully with the conclusion of Sefer Vayikra and the Ramban's understanding of the flow